Do you find yourself constantly having to defend your reputation, to rebut unfair characterizations? Are you in a toxic relationship? Well, chances are you're being manipulated. Hi, I'm Dr. Kerry McAvoy. I'm a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of counseling experience. And here's where we talk about all things related to relationships, particularly toxic relationships. Today we're going to talk about something that is actually a pretty sophisticated manipulative tool. Gavin de Becker, in his book The Gift of Fear, talks about it in his work with looking at criminal behavior, particularly how criminals target and manipulate victims. How they get us to go along with something that seemingly is definitely not in our best interest. It's going to go terribly wrong. He uses something that we're all vulnerable to, and that is the desire to look good to another person. Why does this matter? Well, because believe it or not, our personalities is a bit of an open loop, so we're always taking in feedback from other people. Not just that we want them to think well of us, but it also affects the way that we feel and see ourselves. So we're in this constant loop where we're taking in information and then adjusting our sense of self in that process. And plus, we also want to have a sense of belonging. That's very important to us. In fact, Maslow, in the hierarchy of needs, listed that sense of belonging was above safety. So right after we establish that we are emotionally, physically, and psychologically safe, we then begin to look for a sense of belonging. Manipulators or toxic people use these qualities against us. Now, is it intentional or unintentional? And actually, that part doesn't matter so much as the profound effect on us. Obviously, those who are psychopaths are using these strategies in an effort to manipulate us into a vulnerable position. So in that instance, it is intentional. But many toxic people who do this aren't consciously doing it. It's part of the mechanism that they have developed in their immaturity as a way to ward off anxiety and unpleasant feelings about themselves. And so, in order to do that, they use what's called typecasting. What is typecasting? Well, have you ever had someone say to you, "You're not one of those people, are you?" And then they proceed to describe that individual, some characteristic. I remember when I was in a toxic relationship, this person that I was in the relationship with said to me, "You're not going to be one of these controlling women, are you?" Now, I didn't need to, that characterization was definitely unfair and it was very misogynistic, but I felt a surge of a desire to prove this person wrong. And as a result, every time I hit it, for instance, when I might have exercised a bit more independence, my tendency was to be more compliant versus to be more my own person, to do things the way that I wanted to do it. In other words, that person gained a bit of control over me in those situations. But typecasting can be used in lots of other ways. It can also be used where they identify a category or group of people or an undesired characteristic out there as a way to warn you of a way not to be. Have you ever been on a date with someone and then they tell you about their exes or previous relationships? This person was like that. They worried about everything. They had somebody else who was always hanging out with friends. These are subtle cues and bits of information that tell you of ways not to be, so that you're more likely to come into the relationship. If you agree to move forward with a relationship, you're more likely to come into the relationship knowing that you better be careful to the degree that you make this person a priority over your other friendships. Or you need to be sure that you don't complain too much because you don't want to be like that person. So it gives you sort of, in a way, a script of behavior, a way in which they want you to show up in this relationship. And again, in that moment, they are then controlling the narrative and controlling you. So now you know to kind of keep yourself a little smaller, less bold, less maybe proactive, maybe less independent. And you effectively are managed. So typecasting, the purpose of typecasting is to gain compliance over the victim, over the target, or over the love interest. It can happen in a variety of settings. It's not just necessarily with romantic partners. It can happen in families. It can happen in workplaces. At any time that there's sadly, human relationships, you can have a problem with typecasting. There are times where you may have a family will look at somebody on the outside and say, look at that. We don't want to be like that. And again, the message is to everyone within the family is don't avoid those types of behavior. Or maybe they're scapegoating one family member and they're saying, look at so-and-so. Can you believe how clumsy that person is? And then you get the message of, oh, I better keep myself together and not act like that because look what happens when I do that. Typecasting, unfortunately, is always a manipulative move that relinquishes power, gives power from you to the other person. So what are we supposed to do when we encounter it? Well, one, if you hear that setup and you feel the urge to feel smaller, note to self that that's what's happening and make sure that you resist it. Most likely, if you can, I would avoid those relationships. If you're going out on a date and you hear this comment, that would, to me, be a clear sign this is somebody that probably isn't going to accept you the way that you are. If it's in the family, that becomes tougher, especially if you're not been able to leave the home or you're a minor. Then you're a little more under the control of the situation. But it helps to be aware. By just self-awareness creates a better defense against it, so you're more likely to resist it. And then the other thing is to give yourself permission to show up whatever way. Now, it may have social consequences. You may then end up being the person at work that gets talked about. But be prepared for those types of risks when you enter into these situations. You knowingly know that this is going to happen, that you knowingly know that this is a toxic environment or a toxic situation. So I would be curious to know if you've ever experienced typecasting. Please let me know what's happened. How did you deal with it? Did the relationship work out? Interestingly enough, the person that I met that I described to you that did it with me, yeah, it was pretty manipulative, powerful effect. And I found myself wanting to resist being those ways. And sadly, it ended up going really badly for me. And now I'm on alert. And when I hear it, it's interesting. I see it a lot. I'm not on dating apps at the moment, but when I was dating there for a while, I saw a lot on dating apps like, you're not going to be one of those people. Or, but if you hear that, that's code. That's code that this is going to be a very challenging relationship and likely a toxic one. So thank you so much for joining me today and learning a little bit more about typecasting. I highly recommend Gavin de Becker's book, The Gift of Fear. If you want to be able to prevent yourself, kind of proof yourself against predators, specifically predators, it's a fabulous book. And it gives you other hints and tips about how to spot things like typecasting, other manipulative moves to lose control in a situation that makes you vulnerable. Please like and subscribe and come back and join me again where we talk about all things related to relationships.